He found her on the road to Stillwater on a Tuesday in October when the sky was flat and gray and the wind was pushing dead leaves across the dirt like it was trying to bury something. He almost didn't see her. She was small and still, and she was sitting against a fence post on the side of the road in a way that didn't look like resting. It looked like stopping, like whatever had been moving her forward had run out, and this fence post was as far as the fuel would take her, and now she was done. Emmett Calloway pulled the wagon to a halt and sat there for a moment looking at her. She was maybe 8 years old, thin in a way that wasn't natural, the kind of thin that comes from weeks of not enough, not days. Her dress was torn and filthy and too big for her, and her feet were bare, and her hair was a dark, matted tangle that hung over her face like a curtain she'd pulled closed against the world. Her legs were bent beneath her at angles that didn't look right. Not broken. Something else. Something permanent. They lay on the ground like things that belonged to someone else, limp and useless, and she made no effort to move them or arrange them or hide them. She just sat there against the post with her arms wrapped around herself and her head down and a piece of paper pinned to the front of her dress that fluttered in the wind. Emmett climbed down from the wagon. He was 51 years old and he moved like a man who'd spent every one of those years working land that didn't care whether he lived or died. He was tall and broad, and his face was weathered into deep lines, and his hands were scarred and enormous, and he knelt down in the dirt 3 feet from the girl and took his hat off and held it at his side, because his mother had taught him that you take your hat off when you're in the presence of someone who's suffering, and this child was suffering in a way that made the dirt road seem cruel for existing beneath her. "Hey there," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice you use with spooked animals and broken people. "My name's Emmett. You hurt?" She didn't look up. She didn't move. For a moment he thought she might be dead and his stomach dropped, but then he saw her fingers tighten around her own arms, and he knew she was alive. She was just deciding whether to acknowledge him. "Leave me," she said. Her voice was small and dry and flat. "Everyone does." The words hit him like a fist to the sternum, not because they were dramatic, because they weren't. They were said with the plain, exhausted certainty of someone who had tested a fact enough times to stop questioning it. "Leave me. Everyone does." She was 8 years old and she'd already built a law of the universe out of being abandoned, and the worst part was that the universe had given her every reason to believe it was true. He looked at the paper pinned to her dress. He leaned close enough to read it without touching her. It was written in a rough hand, the letters uneven and smudged, and it said, "Cripple girl, can't walk, parents dead, no use to anyone." Emmett read it twice. Then he unpinned it from her dress, carefully, the way you'd remove a thorn, and he folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. He didn't crumple it. He didn't tear it up. He put it away because destroying it wouldn't undo what it said, and keeping it would remind him, every time he felt the paper in his pocket, of what the world had done to this child, and what he was going to undo. "What's your name?" he said. She still didn't look up. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." A pause. The wind pushed more leaves across the road. A crow called from somewhere in the gray sky. "Sadie," she said. "Sadie. That's a good name. Sadie, I'm not going to leave you here." "You will. They all say they won't, and they all do." "Who's they?" "The first family took me after Mama and Papa died. They kept me 2 months and said I was too much work. The second family kept me 3 weeks, and the man said a girl who can't walk can't earn her keep. The third one didn't even bring me inside. She looked at my legs and said no, and the man from the church brought me back. Then he left me here." She said all of this without lifting her head, without changing her tone, without crying. She recited it the way a child recites a lesson they've memorized. Flat, complete, final. "The man from the church left you on the side of the road," Emmett said. "Not a question, a reckoning. He said someone would come along. He said God provides." "How long ago was that?" "I don't know. It was warmer then." Emmett looked at the sky. It was October. If it had been warmer when she was left, that meant weeks. This child had been sitting on the side of a road for weeks, surviving on what? Rainwater from puddles, scraps from passing wagons, the stubbornness of a body that refused to stop, even when the spirit inside it had every reason to. He stood up. He took off his coat, and he draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her. She disappeared inside it like a bird inside a feed sack, and for the first time she looked up. Her face was thin and dirty, and there were dark circles under her eyes, and her lips were cracked, and her cheeks were hollow. But her eyes were brown and enormous, and alive in a way that contradicted everything else about her. They were furious, not at him, at everything. At the road and the fence post and the paper and the families and the churchman and the God who was supposed to provide and hadn't. She was 8 years old and she was furious at the entire world. And that fury was the only thing keeping her breathing. "I'm going to pick you up now," Emmett said. "And I'm going to put you in my wagon. And I'm going to take you home. And you're going to eat something and sleep in a bed. And tomorrow when you wake up, I'm still going to be there. And the day after that. And the day after that. And you don't have to believe me. You just have to let me pick you up." She looked at him with those furious brown eyes. She looked at his face, his scarred hands, his size. She was calculating. Not whether he was kind. She'd stopped believing in kind. She was calculating whether she had the strength to fight him if he wasn't. And the answer was no. She didn't have the strength. She didn't have anything. So she uncrossed her arms and let them fall to her sides, and she said nothing, which was as close to permission as she could give. He picked her up. She weighed nothing. She weighed less than a feed sack, and that fact made something in his chest crack in a way that he knew would never fully heal. He carried her to the wagon and set her on the bench, and climbed up beside her and picked up the reins, and they rode toward his ranch in silence, while the wind blew and the leaves scattered, and the fence post stood empty on the side of the road, like a monument to everything the world should be ashamed of. By the way, if this story is already pulling at something deep inside you, take a second to subscribe and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. We read every single one. Now let's continue. Emmett Calloway had a story of his own, and it wasn't a gentle one. He'd been married for 12 years to a woman named Rose, who had been the best thing in his life by a distance so large that second place didn't exist. Rose had wanted children the way some people want water. Not as a preference, but as a need. They'd tried for years, every month the same hope, and every month the same answer, and eventually the doctor in town had said what Emmett already suspected, that a fever he'd had as a young man had left him unable to father children. The word the doctor used was sterile. It sounded like a word for a clean room, not for the wreckage it caused. Rose didn't leave. She stayed. She said it didn't matter. She said he was enough. But he could see it in her eyes every time a woman in town walked past with a baby. He could see the space in her that was shaped like a child and would never be filled, and he carried the guilt of that space like a stone in his chest for every day of their marriage. Rose died 4 years ago. Consumption. It took her slowly, which was worse than fast because slow means you watch. Slow means you sit by the bed and hold her hand while she gets lighter and lighter, until the hand you're holding feels like paper, and the woman inside it is already somewhere else. She died on a Monday morning, and her last words were his name, just his name, and then she was gone, and the cabin was quiet, and the quiet was so absolute that Emmett thought the world itself had stopped. He'd lived alone since then, 4 years. The ranch ran itself because he'd built it to, and because cattle don't care whether the man feeding them is grieving or not. He went to town for supplies, and he spoke to people when speaking was required, and he came home and sat in the chair Rose used to sit in, and he didn't read, or whittle, or think. He just sat. He was 51 years old, and he had a ranch and a herd and a cabin with 2 chairs, and one of them was empty, and he'd accepted that it would stay empty, because the world had made it clear that Emmett Calloway was meant to go through it alone. Not as punishment, just as fact. The way some land doesn't grow wheat, the way some wells come up dry. He was a dry well, and he'd made peace with it, the way you make peace with something you can't change, which is to say, not really, but enough to keep moving. And then he found Sadie. He brought her home and carried her inside and set her in Rose's chair, and she sat there, looking at the cabin with those enormous eyes, scanning everything the way she'd scanned his face on the road, looking for the trap, looking for the angle, looking for the thing that would prove that this was temporary too. He heated water. He made broth from dried beef and potatoes because he didn't know what to feed a child who'd been starving for weeks, and he figured something warm and simple was better than something heavy. He set the bowl on the table in front of her with a spoon and stepped back and gave her room. She looked at the broth. She looked at him. Then she picked up the spoon and she ate with the controlled desperation of someone who has learned that food can be taken away at any time. So you eat fast, but you don't show how hungry you are, because showing hunger is showing weakness, and weakness is what gets you left on the side of a road. She didn't speak for 3 days. She ate what he gave her. She slept in the bed he made up for her in the small room off the kitchen. She let him carry her from the bed to the chair, and from the chair to the porch, and from the porch back to the bed. But she didn't speak. She watched him the way a prisoner watches a guard, constantly, carefully, waiting for the shift change that brings the cruel one. On the 4th day, she said, "Why are you doing this?" Emmett was at the stove. He didn't turn around. "Because you needed someone to." "That's not a reason. The churchman said God provides. The first family said they wanted to help. The second family said every child deserves a home." They all had reasons. None of them stayed. He turned around. He looked at her sitting in Rose's chair with her useless legs and her furious eyes and her 8 years of evidence that the world was not to be trusted. "You're right," he said. "Reasons don't mean anything. Staying means something. So I'm going to skip the reasons and just stay, and you can decide what that means when you're ready." She stared at him. Then she looked away and said nothing. But her hand, which had been gripping the arm of the chair hard enough to turn her knuckles white, loosened one finger at a time. He built her a chair with wheels. It took him 2 weeks. He'd never built anything like it, and he got it wrong 3 times before he got it right. The first version was too heavy for her to move. The second version tipped over on uneven ground. The third version had wheels that stuck. The fourth version worked. It was rough and ugly, and a proper craftsman would have laughed at it, but it rolled on the cabin floor, and it rolled on the porch, and it rolled on the hard-packed dirt of the yard. And when he set Sadie in it, and she pushed the wheels with her hands and moved on her own, under her own power, for the first time in God knows how long, her face did something he hadn't seen it do before. It opened. The anger didn't leave. The wariness didn't leave, but something else came through, something that had been buried so deep under survival that she'd probably forgotten it existed. She moved across the yard, and she looked at her hands on the wheels, and she looked at the ground passing beneath her, and she said, "I'm fast." "You are." "I'm faster than walking." "Probably." She looked at him, and for 1 second, just one, the fury in her eyes stepped aside, and something else was there. It was gone before he could name it, but he'd seen it, and it was enough to keep building. He enrolled her in the schoolhouse. He carried her there the first day and set her in the wheeled chair and pushed her to the door, and the teacher, a young woman named Miss Pruitt, looked at Sadie and then at the chair and then at Emmett and said, "She can't climb the steps." Emmett looked at the 3 wooden steps leading to the schoolhouse door. He came back the next morning with lumber and tools, and he built a ramp. It took him 4 hours, and Miss Pruitt watched from the window, and the children watched from inside. And when it was done, Sadie rolled up the ramp and through the door on her own, and the look on her face was not gratitude, it was conquest. She learned fast, faster than the other children, which frustrated some of their parents and delighted Miss Pruitt. She could read within a month. She could figure numbers within 2. She had a mind that worked like a trap, quick, precise, and once it closed on something, it didn't let go. Miss Pruitt told Emmett after 6 weeks that Sadie was the brightest student she'd ever taught, and Emmett said, "Don't tell her that. She's got enough reasons to be angry at the world for wasting her time." The town had opinions. Cedar Ridge always had opinions. A childless widower taking in a crippled orphan girl. Some said it was charity. Some said it was pity. Some said darker things that Emmett heard secondhand and chose not to respond to, because responding would require letting go of something inside him that he wasn't sure he could put back once it was out. He let the talk pass. He let it fade. And eventually it did, the way talk always does when the thing it's talking about refuses to perform for it. But there was one man who didn't let it fade. His name was Vernon Galt, and he sat on the town council, and he came to Emmett's ranch one afternoon with a paper and a frown, and said the council had concerns about the welfare of the child, and whether a single man with no experience raising children and no blood relation to the girl was a suitable guardian. Emmett listened to all of it, standing in his doorway with his arms at his sides. When Vernon was done, Emmett said, "You want to talk about suitable. That child was left on the side of a road with a note pinned to her dress that said she was no use to anyone. 3 families took her, and 3 families gave her back. The church abandoned her on a fence post in September, and not one person in this town went looking. Not you, not the council, not anyone. And now you're standing on my porch questioning whether I'm suitable. He took a step forward. Get off my land, Vernon, and don't come back unless you're bringing something that child actually needs, which isn't a paper, it's an apology. Vernon left. The council never sent another representative, and Sadie, who had heard every word from behind the kitchen door, didn't mention it that evening. But when Emmett sat down to supper, she'd made biscuits for the first time, lumpy and dense and slightly burned on the bottom, and she set one on his plate without looking at him and said, "I made those." And he ate every crumb and said they were the best biscuits he'd ever had, which was a lie, but some lies are more true than the truth. Sadie called him Emmett for the first year, not Daddy, not Papa, not Sir. Emmett. She said it like a word she was testing, pressing on it to see if it held weight. He didn't correct her. He didn't suggest alternatives. Names are earned, not assigned, and he understood that whatever she called him would mean more if she chose it herself. The change happened on a night in February. A storm came through, the worst of the winter, and the wind screamed against the cabin walls, and the snow piled against the door, and the fire in the stove guttered and spat. Sadie couldn't sleep. Emmett heard her chair creaking in her room, and he went to the doorway and saw her sitting by the window, watching the storm with her arms wrapped around herself and her eyes wide. "Scared?" he asked. "No, cold." He brought a blanket and draped it over her shoulders and turned to leave, and she said, "Don't go." He stopped. She'd never asked him to stay before. She'd never asked him for anything beyond the basic mechanics of survival. He pulled a chair next to hers and sat down, and they watched the storm together in silence. The wind howled, the cabin creaked, the fire found its courage again, and the room warmed, and somewhere in the middle of it, Sadie's head tipped sideways and came to rest against his arm. She was asleep. She was asleep, leaning against him, and her face was soft in a way he'd never seen it, because the anger was sleeping too, and underneath it was just a girl. Just a small, tired, extraordinary girl who had been left on the side of a road by a world that couldn't see what she was worth, and had somehow ended up here, in a cabin, in a storm, leaning against the arm of a man who couldn't father children, but could build a chair with wheels and a ramp to a schoolhouse, and a life worth staying for. He didn't move. He sat there until morning with her head on his arm, and the storm raging outside, and something inside him that had been dry for 51 years finally, quietly, filling with water. She called him Papa for the first time 3 days later. She said it at breakfast, casually, like she'd been saying it her whole life. "Papa, the eggs are burning." He turned to the stove and saved the eggs, and his hands were shaking, and his vision was blurred, and he didn't say a word about it, because some moments are so full that speaking would only make them smaller. 5 years later, Sadie was 13, and she ran the household books and could calculate cattle prices in her head faster than any broker in Cedar Ridge. She'd read every book in the schoolhouse, and Miss Pruitt had started borrowing books from the library in Helena specifically for her. She navigated the ranch in her chair with a speed and efficiency that made grown men step out of her way, not from pity, but from self-preservation. She had opinions about everything, and the vocabulary to defend them, and a tongue sharp enough to make the barber stop talking mid-sentence, which no one in Cedar Ridge had ever managed before. She'd also started teaching. Not officially, but the younger children at the schoolhouse gravitated to her during breaks, and she'd explain things to them in ways that Miss Pruitt couldn't, with a directness that came from knowing what it felt like to be underestimated. A boy named Charlie, who couldn't read at 9, sat next to Sadie for 2 months, and by Christmas, he was reading aloud in class. His mother brought a pie to the ranch and set it on the table and said to Emmett, "Your daughter did what 3 years of schooling couldn't." Emmett looked at the pie and then at Sadie, and Sadie shrugged like it was nothing. But the corner of her mouth moved in a way that told him it was everything. Emmett was 56, and he was tired, and his back hurt, and his knees ached, and he was the happiest he'd ever been in his life. He had a daughter, not from his blood, not from his body, from a fence post on the road to Stillwater, where the world had thrown away a girl who turned out to be worth more than every person who'd ever left her. One evening, Sadie rolled onto the porch where Emmett was sitting, and she parked her chair next to his, and they watched the sun go down the way they did most evenings, in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need words to know they belong to each other. "Papa," she said. "Yeah. That note. The one that was pinned to my dress. You still have it?" He reached into the pocket of his coat. The same coat. He'd never changed it. The paper was worn soft and the creases were dark with age. He unfolded it and held it where she could see it. "Cripple girl. Can't walk. Parents dead. No use to anyone." Sadie looked at it for a long time. Then she took it from his hand and she tore it in half. Then in quarters. Then into pieces so small the wind took them off her palm like dust. "That's not me," she said. "No," Emmett said. "It never was." She leaned her head against his arm the way she'd done that first night in the storm, and Emmett sat there on his porch with his daughter beside him and the pieces of that note scattered across the yard like something the world had finally agreed to let go of. If this story reminded you that the people the world throws away are often the ones worth holding closest, if it showed you that a father is not made by blood, but by every morning he chooses to stay, then you're in the right place. Subscribe for more stories of broken people who build whole lives, of children who refuse to give up, and of love that begins where the road ends. Subscribe now and don't miss the next one.